Imperial yeast is at it again with their Imperialis project, creating yet another unique proprietary strain through the hybridization of two other yeasts. In addition to its excellent attenuation and rapid reduction of diacetyl, I-10 Mangostini contributes robust, ripe tropical fruit, strawberry, and lychee notes to beer that complement modern hops. And as a Kveik hybrid, it can be fermented anywhere from 78 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 26 to 32 degrees Celsius without issue. Head over to imperialyeast.com to learn more about I-10 Mangostini and be sure to pick some up for your next batch of fruity IPA. I think it's safe to say that both the craft beer and homebrewing booms are buttressed by the overwhelming love of hoppy beer. I can't remember the last time I went to a brewery that didn't have a few taps dedicated to various versions of Pale Ale and IPA. Now, in order to achieve maximum hop character, brewers have developed a bunch of techniques that they claim helps to accomplish this goal. You're listening to the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me on this episode to chat about the unique method called dip hopping is contributor Jordan Folks.
There's so many different ways that brewers have tried to maximize hop character between double dry hopping, whirlpool temperature, etc. And dip hopping was one of those ones. When I read about it in BYO magazine, I was like, what the heck is this? I've got to try it.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think we're done developing methods for, extracting as much hop character as possible. It's just such a huge focus right now. When I brewed my first IPA back in 2003, I remember the goal was to create the most bitter beer that was still palatable. So everyone was kind of pushing for, how many hops can you throw in right at the start of the boil, but still want a beer that you're gonna want to drink, right? It's not gonna peel the enamel off your teeth. We were definitely after aroma and flavor, but man, it was nothing like it is today. I mean, a bunch of brewers I know skip bittering additions altogether nowadays, opting for, only late kettle additions to preserve as much of that hop character as possible. I love where things have come, and while I may have no personal experience with this novel method of dip hopping, I certainly appreciate anything that increases the hoppy goodness we all love so much. All right, if you're a fan of this show and you'd like to receive a reward for your support, consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. By making a small monthly pledge, you'll receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. This month's guest is Brewlosophy's own Steve Thanos, who in addition to being a contributor here, has served on the board of his local homebrew club and is perhaps one of the more creative brewers on the crew. If you recall, Steve was the co-host on our episode about naming beers, which has been one of the most popular in the last year, and he also loves doing some wonky stuff with his beer. If you want to be a part of this session, you have to make your pledge at patreon.com/Brewlosophy no later than Friday, June 23rd, 2023, as Steve's going to be taking those questions on Saturday the 24th. All past sessions are available on our private Patreon and Facebook pages, so patrons can go back and watch them whenever they like. Learn more about becoming a patron over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. And if you wouldn't mind letting us know what you think about this show by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to podcasts, we really would appreciate it, as it helps those who haven't heard of us yet to more easily find the show. Plus, we like knowing what you think. Feedback is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who offer brewers various options for high-quality, reasonably priced electric brewing rigs in various voltages and sizes. I've used their 120-volt system for 5-gallon batches, as well as their 240-volt 10-gallon setup, which I know that you just got into as well, Jordan, and I'm telling you, these things are awesome. Clawhammer Supply really puts the effort into ensuring their systems do exactly as they're intended to do in as efficient a way as possible. If you're not ready to make the jump to electric yet, they also sell 10 and 20-gallon brew-in-a-bag homebrewing starter kits. And if you've been considering going electric, do yourself a favor and visit clawhammersupply.com. We're confident you're going to love their stuff just as much as we do. That's clawhammersupply.com. Listener Alton Stevens hit us up with some feedback after listening to the episode where we talked about brewery names. Alton says, I'm listening to the podcast to keep me sane and help prevent me from walking out the door of the office and quitting my job. And I'm hearing you talk about brewery names. Yes, it may be my garage, but it pays homage to my grandfather. He called the road we live on, family land since 1900, Poverty Ridge. So my brewery is Poverty Ridge Brewing. Pop's Porter has a label with a picture of my grandfather from the 1940s smoking a pipe as he was cutting ice on the lake to sell to tourists throughout the summer. I love that story so much, Jordan. Did you ever come up with a brewery name for your home brewery?
I did, but I don't know if I'm allowed to use it anymore. So for those listening may know that I'm a research scientist by day. And so my brewery name was Standard Deviation. So kind of a homage to, statistician by day, brewer by night. But since then, a brewery in San Francisco has opened called Standard Deviant or something like that. So
yep.
I even had a local artist make me like a custom tap handle, and the O in Standard Deviation is the Standard Deviation sign. So I have this really cool brand, but luckily I'm not commercial, so I can do whatever I want. Exactly.
You're not going to get in trouble as a home brewery for calling your brewery whatever the hell you want to call it. So Alton, I love the name Poverty Ridge Brewing. I think it's rad. I don't have a story nearly as cool as that or as cool as yours, Jordan. But before I started Brewlosophy, I was brewing with a buddy of mine, Chris, pretty much every week for maybe a year and a half, 2 years. And we came up with a name for our brewery. I'm sure I talked about this in that episode. We called it Bright Spot Brewing. That to this day still has meaning to me. I think about this concept of a bright spot, which really just defined those momentary experiences that, in the moment may not feel like much, but 20 years down the line, they still have this meaning for you, and you remember just that moment. So I think it's pretty cool. And, I don't use that term for anything else anymore. I think we might have some recipes out there online still with the Bright Spot Brewing tag on it or whatever, but Poverty Ridge Brewing, man, that is really rad. It has a nice ring to it, and the story behind the name makes it all the better. So thanks for writing in, Alton. If you have show feedback, you could send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or drop us a line on social media. If you haven't already, please go subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Brewlosophy Show, at youtube.com/@TheBrewlosophy Show. That's Brewlosophy with a U, no umlaut needed. You're going to do youtube.com/the Brewlosophy Show. Martin is producing all sorts of rad content over there, which, judging by how rapidly the channel is growing, we're already at over 15,000 subscribers after just a couple of months of being around. I'd say people are loving what he's doing over there. All right, when we're back from this break, our focus will be on the method of dip hopping. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. Chilling wort can be a chore, especially after a long brew day, but not with the Xchillerator Counterflow Chiller, which can chill a 5-gallon or 19-liter batch of wort in 5 minutes or less, leading to a strong cold break and clear wort in the fermenter. Brewlosophy's Matt Del Fiacco uses the Xchillerator Max and absolutely loves it. In addition to improved chilling efficiency, every Xchillerator comes with a 5-year warranty that covers the entire chiller for manufacturer defects. If you're looking to up your chilling game and a CFC is right for you, head over to xchillerator.com today. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. There's no question that hoppy styles of beer like IPA and American Pale Ale have evolved over the last few decades, with a huge emphasis being on getting as much fruity character out of the hops as possible. While the breeding of new hop varieties that are high in these fruity essential oils has certainly spurred this evolution, so too is the development of unique methods aimed at preserving the desirable compounds present in hops. Jordan, before we get into dip hopping specifically, I thought it would be good to spend a minute talking about hops in general.
Great. So what exactly is a hop, Marshall?
One thing I know for sure is that it's a flower that grows on a vine and not a vine. I can tell you that.
And is it hop or hops?
Oh my God. That's so funny that you bring that up. We did a stupid article many, many years ago where I went into the whole thing about the hops thing. My understanding is that hops is plural. So it is a hop cone, not a hops cone, but people can do what they want. I know I've gotten a lot of flack for calling people out on that. I do it just jokingly, but I call them hops hops, and it's a hop cone, not a hops cone.
And I think that the cone itself, right? There's a lot of misnomers out there, be it flower or something like that, right? Because it's not a flower, right?
My understanding is it actually is the flower of the plant, is the actual cone. But I get it. There's like it doesn't
leaf.
look like a rose, or
You hear whole leaf.
Well, people call it whole leaf. I was corrected. I called it whole leaf when I first started brewing. That was how I started. The homebrew shop I went to didn't even sell me pellets, so I called them whole leaf, and I got corrected by a hop grower, and he said they're actually called whole cones. We don't refer to them as leaf hops. So he said a leaf is a part of the cone. Is what I was told.
Yeah. So it's these flowers, leaves, cones, something like that. That, as we know, also come in various products like pelletized versions, etc. But it all starts with the cone, and that cone contains various things that contribute, various qualities to beer, be it bitterness, flavor, aroma, and it seems that it can be very, variety dependent. It's not like all hops are the same thing. And so we know that Citra can taste different than Mosaic, then it can taste different than Fogel. And so ultimately, these things are contributing things like alpha acids, beta acids, and essential oils to the beer that really help balance the malt character, and in some cases push it to the max, like an IPA, to really go for that hop flavor and aroma.
Yeah. Exactly. And anybody who has everyone listening to this podcast has messed around with hops in some way or another, likely pellets, probably hop cones as well that have been dried. But if you've ever grown hops, or if you've ever been to a hop growing region during harvest season and you've pulled one of these cones off of the vine and you've rubbed it in your hands, you'll very quickly realize that there's a sticky substance on the inside that we call lupulin. The cone comes from the Humulus lupulus plant. That is the hop plant. And that lupulin is what holds all of the magic of hops. There are products out there like Lupomax or Cryo hops that are have a higher concentration of the lupulin with less of that vegetal matter, because what we've realized is that the leafy part of that hop cone isn't necessarily contributing anything positive to the beer. And so what we're trying to do when we're using hops and trying to get all of the goodness that they impart to beer is that lupulin. We want to get as much of that lupulin in there as possible. So within that is, like you mentioned, alpha acids, which we know when you heat alpha acids, which happens during the boil, when you're adding hops during the boil, this process of isomerization occurs. And in that process, those alpha acids become iso or isomerized alpha acids, which contribute the bitterness that we expect in beer. And there are varying levels of bitterness in all the different styles of beer. So we adjust that by the amount of hops used and the length of the time they're in the boil, as well as the type of hops, depending on the level of alpha acids that are present in that particular variety of hops. Now, one thing about alpha acids that I think is interesting is that they do degrade over time. There are things brewers can do to preserve those alpha acids by storing them in the freezer, keeping them cold, and keeping them out of oxygen, out of reach of oxygen. You want to keep them in tightly sealed or vacuum sealed even bags, so that the oxygen does not come into contact with them, because that oxygen will have an interaction with what are called beta acids in the hops that only come out. The bitterness only really comes out of these beta acids when they become oxidized. If you've ever taken a sip of a beer where you're like, that doesn't taste right, and that bitterness feels like it's going to burn my tongue off, there's a good chance that's beta acid bitterness, which has an inverse relationship in a weird way with alpha acid presence. So as those alpha acids degrade due to oxidation and age, beta acids, the bittering power of those beta acids actually increases. Do beta and alpha acids contribute in any way to aroma and flavor? I'm not entirely sure. We've done some experiments where, we've compared hops or beers that are bittered at 60 minutes to a beer that's bittered, say, at 10 or 15 minutes. But you have to use so many more hops that it's really difficult to determine what is it that, is it really the alpha acids that are contributing that difference in aroma, that perceptible difference in aroma and flavor, or is it all of the other stuff that we're going to talk about here in a minute?
Right. And have we ever compared low alpha versus high alpha in a 60-minute edition?
Yeah, we've done it a few times. I think the first one we did, if I'm not mistaken, was like Magnum, which is around 12% alpha acid, to Sots, which was something like 3% alpha acid. I forget the results, but again, when you do that and you parse it out, it's impossible to determine with our instruments, which are participants' mouths, basically. You can't determine whether if a perceived difference was because of the bitterness or if it was because of all of the other things that are different between Magnum and Sots. You just have to accept that those two are different, right?
Right, because there's different levels of myrcene, humulene, you name it, but not to mention the vegetal matter increase associated with achieving the same IBU from a lower alpha acid.
Yeah, it's really the whole vegetal matter thing is weird. And I feel like in a show where we're talking about ultimately, hop, aroma, and flavor, you can't ignore the vegetal matter argument. I talked about it with Martin on the Brewlosophy show. In fact, I made a short and shoddy, I think it was a Czech Pilsner or something like that. And the issue that I had with that is that Sots is such a low alpha hop that by reducing the boil, I had to almost double the amount of Sots hops that went in at the start of that boil just to achieve my desired IBU, bitterness level. And I have a feeling that the overabundance of those hops, I think it was from the vegetal matter, all that leafy matter that I had to throw in there, made it taste kind of rubbery. And that, again, that's a subjective, description that I came up with. Other people had different descriptions for it, but if you overdo the amount of vegetal matter, that's the beautiful thing about a lot of these modern hop products that are coming out, is that you can eliminate that risk, right? You're not throwing as much leafy material into your beer, which also has the downstream outcome of increasing yield, because that stuff absorbs beer or wort, as it were. So, what's your experience with that kind of vegetal over hopped because of the leafy material? What have you experienced with that?
Yeah, I definitely disagree with you on that. Granted, I wasn't there to taste the beer, and we'll never know, but I routinely use a ton of low alpha hops in my lager brewing. So I only use Hallertau Mittelfrüh or something like that for my bittering additions, all the way to the end for that matter, for my German lagers, and I only use Sots for my Czech lagers. I do not use high alpha Magnum as that bittering addition. And again, I'm probably appealing to authority here, but the Czech brewers claim you got to use Sots the whole way through to make Czech beer. And incredible lager brewers like Ashley Carter at Bierstadt argue that you got to use these low alpha hops the whole way through the process. It's a lot of vegetal matter, but that's part of the je ne quoi of a Helles or something like that, right?
Yeah.
And so I have not had bad experiences. I've had fantastic lagers, but it uses a ton. Like I made a 10-gallon batch of Pilsner with Hallertau Mittelfrüh recently. An entire pound was needed because the alpha was so low.
So I don't disagree with you, actually. I'm fully on board, and I appeal to authority on that aspect of things because I like the way those beers come out in the end. What I'm saying is, in that short and shoddy batch, it was the only time I'd experienced this because I was doing a 20-minute or 25-minute boil. I had to more than double the amount that I would normally use, and I wonder if I don't know if it was because of the leafy material or if it was because of those essential oils just being so much more prominent in there. You have to use a lot more hops because of that isomerization thing. And I don't know, again, I've never experienced that. I always brew, especially if I'm making a Bo Pils, that's 100% Sots in my book. I love the way those turn out. This was the only time that ever happened. So, but those are the things you got to keep in mind, right? Hops have that vegetal matter. And especially when you're making these hoppier styles like Pale Ale and IPA, it's something to keep in the back of your mind. How much am I throwing in? Do I want to use something else? But the key, and I think what most brewers these days are focused on, is the oil content in these hop varieties. And we're lucky. We have so many. It seems like every year there's a new hop variety, specifically for IPA and Pale Ale that promises to be the next big fruity thing. And it's pretty rad. I mean, these hop varieties can contain anywhere from 0.5% to 4% of these essential oils, which doesn't sound like much, but when you look at the 1-ish% essential oil content of, say, a Sots, which is a classic noble hop, to these 3.5% to 4%, El Dorado or Citra, these massively pungent fruit bowl hops. It's pretty gnarly that we've got the ability to just go buy these at Yakima Valley Hops now and make these incredible beers with them, I think.
Right. Yeah. I have a buddy here. He's a pro brewer, but he still homebrews, which is awesome. And he has developed this like kind of experimental oil calculator, and he'll, instead of just thinking about like a little bit of Citra, a little bit of Mosaic, he actually will run the numbers to try to find the ideal oil concentration when choosing his hops for an IPA.
That's awesome. I believe Scott Janish has a really cool calculator on his website as well that does something similar. It's more of a substitution type of thing. And then if you go to ChatGPT, I don't know how accurate it is, but you're like, oh, I don't have, any Simcoe hops right now, but I have these 3 hops. You can ask ChatGPT, like, what combo, should I use of these 3 hops that I have to get close to a Citra, characteristic, and it'll spit something out for you. I don't know the accuracy of that, but these hop oils, again, are key. They are what are responsible largely for the character, that perceptible fruity characteristic that we expect in IPA and Pale Ale. Now, when we talk about hop essential oils, that is kind of the umbrella term for what actually makes up that oil content, which are terpenes. And each terpene is just an individual compound that contributes these desirable characteristics to beers. I think the most common one, well, I know for a fact the most common one in hops, which happens to be the cousin of cannabis as well. So if you look up myrcene, you're going to get a lot of articles and stuff, not just on hops, but on cannabis these days. But myrcene is responsible for that, what they call green hop aroma. When you smell a hop and you're like, there's hops, that's myrcene. It's kind of herbaceous. It can be resinous, a little bit citrusy. Typically, that's a kind of a grapefruit citrusy aroma. The thing is, all of these terpenes evaporate at a different temperature. And so what brewers are doing, and I'm really curious to hear your thoughts, because I know you've experimented a lot with this, Jordan, but what brewers want to do is, well, we know the boil, wort boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit or 100 degrees Celsius. If these desirable compounds evaporate off at a cooler temperature than that, then we've got to do something else to preserve those. And let's see what happens when we do that. I think, you look at things like myrcene, evaporates at 147 degrees Fahrenheit, that's 64 C. Humulene, which is responsible for that woody, piney kind of note that you can get from certain hops, and if it, in higher concentrations, can be kind of floral and herbal as well. That evaporates at 210 degrees Fahrenheit. So as soon as you hit that boil, you're starting to volatilize this humulene. If that's what you want in your beer, adios, right? Farnesene or farnesene is that more floral terpene that's in hops. Again, it can have some citrusy notes as well, but that evaporates between 203 and 257 degrees Fahrenheit, or 95 and 125 C. All of those are below boil temp. So if that's what you want to preserve in your beer, obviously it's not all going away. We've made plenty of beers that have a lot of these characteristics. But if you want it to be more pungently there, you want it to be more present, we've got to come up with methods for preserving those terpenes so that they stay in the wort and ultimately the beer. Right.
And that's where dry hopping can often come in, right? A dry hopped beer just tastes so fundamentally different from one that has not been dry hopped. And I think that's really the defining character in American IPA. And I guess at this point, pale ale as well.
Yeah, I mean, dry hopping is probably, we're gonna move into these different methods that brewers have come up with over the years to preserve these hop oils. But dry hopping is probably the most notable, the easiest to use, and it's been done for centuries. I mean, that's kind of what, a lot of people say is when the English brewers were trying to preserve this beer that they're shipping overseas, they would just toss in a bunch of hops because they recognize that it has this antibacterial or antimicrobial properties. And it would also, which would, I suppose, extend the shelf life of these beers that they were sending away from their breweries. It still maintains these properties, obviously, but it also contributes a ton of hop character to beer. I mean, it's necessary in certain styles, maybe not pale ale, but definitely, are you going to make an IPA that's not dry hopped?
I mean, at that point, this is just a pale ale, in my opinion, or a strong ale or something.
Exactly. You have to dry hop them, but that is not the only approach. And I feel like, other things that brewers will do. I made my first IPA 20 years ago, which isn't that long in the grand scheme of things. But back then, you dry hopped an IPA, fine, but it wasn't with the crazy amounts or methods that we're using today. One of our bigger focuses was, at what point do we add hops to get flavor, to get aroma? And it was just 30 minutes for flavor and 15 minutes left for your aroma. And then you might throw in a half ounce of dry hop, but really you were after just this bitterness. I mean, that's what it seemed to be at the time when I was brewing, at least. Nowadays, people are doing all kinds of crazy stuff. There's these late kettle additions. Obviously, that's going to preserve a lot more aroma and flavor than early kettle additions, but people are using massive amounts of late kettle additions in order to reduce the volatilization or evaporation of these hop oils.
Yeah, and then like we talked about at the top, their alpha acids are relevant here, and you're still going to be extracting alpha acids towards the end of the boil, just fewer. So you have to kind of be cognizant of the interactions here because on one hand, you don't want to use too many hops on the front end if you're using a ton of whirlpool additions because you still are extracting some isomerized alpha acids, and you want to, make sure you're not making too bitter of a beer. But people are saying that these late kettle additions don't have as harsh or intensive a bitterness, even though they are providing some level of perceptible bitterness, be it a measurable IBU or not. And so thinking about that recipe design kind of holistically, but in addition to that is you have this whole issue of volume loss. Is all of a sudden you're like, I thought I was making 5 gallons of beer. I have 3 gallons left because I used so many whirlpool additions.
Yeah. It's funny. I was probably like 12 years ago or so. I was introducing my buddy with the whole Bright Spot story I told earlier. I was introducing him to the brewing thing and we're getting going. And all the talk back then was West Coast IPA. And I remember being like, well, what is that? And the idea back then, at least, was that West Coast IPAs are going to be notably less bitter and being notably more hoppy, meaning they're going to have more of that fruity, piney, whatever characteristic in the hops that you want to get in there. And the technique that was used was reduce your early kettle additions and increase your late kettle additions. And then you can do everything else the same, obviously using more modern hops. Back then, that was Amarillo, that was Simcoe, Citra had just come out, Mosaic, stuff like that. But that was really the push. Also, of course, don't put any crystal malt in there, but that was the big thing. And I remember that had a big influence on the way that I approach making hoppy beers in general, because it did kind of question the old tome of 60-30-15 bitterness, flavor, aroma, right? You're still going to get that bitterness from those late kettle additions, but understanding that isomerization is a function of both alpha acid presence and time in the boil, you're able to modulate that a bit and use a higher amount of hops without creating these bitter bombs, which I think is pretty great. Another technique that came out, I remember reading an article, and I think it was about what was the brewery name, Abita or something like that, out of Georgia, I believe. And I
think they're New Orleans or Louisiana.
It could be. Yeah. It was, I believe it was an article in BYO, again, 10, 12 years ago, something like that. And they were talking about how they were at least experimenting with an approach of making, this is all paraphrased because it's from memory, but making an IPA that wasn't dry hopped because in order to avoid oxidation issues. But what they did was a hop stand, which is an approach that's really interesting, where when the boil is over, rather than tossing in just a huge amount of flame out hops, which is very common still, that's another way to get a lot of hop character. You toss in a huge dose of hops right at flame out, and then you start to chill it, and it goes down through these different temperatures without completely evaporating all of those terpenes off. A hop stand goes one step further and says, all right, chill that wort to about 170 degrees Fahrenheit first, that's 77C, and then make this huge hop addition. Now you're below that volatilization point for all of these terpenes that you want to be around, and then let those sit there for 15, 20, 30 minutes, and then move on, proceed like normal, right? Finish chilling that wort and get it down to your pitching temp and move on from there. Hop stands that was like all the rage 10 years ago. Everybody I knew who was making hoppy beer was doing that. We did multiple experiments on it where we did different, chilling temperatures and then comparing it to flame out temperature or even late kettle additions. And we couldn't seem to pan it out. We couldn't seem to support this idea that a hop stand actually has a noticeable impact on the perceptible hop character in beer, but it is a method that a lot of people to this day continue to use.
Yeah, they also call it cool pooling, and I know that it's really popular in hazy IPAs, and I think I've heard some brewers talk about that they find that it really works well in the hazy format, but maybe not as much for the West Coast format, and that they'll tend to add their hops hotter, at flame out, at 0 minutes for the West Coast IPA. Me personally, I was doing the Cool Pool method for a little while back there, in both hazy and West Coast IPAs. And that same brewer friend I mentioned that does the oil calculator, he makes really fantastic West Coast IPAs. In fact, they just won gold in like the North American Beer Cup or something like that for their West Coast IPA. And he says they add them. He likes it better when he adds it straight after the boil. And I gave it a try, and I don't know if I liked it better or just as good, but it's a heck of a lot easier than chilling it first. So that's where I've landed.
Yeah, the chilling it first thing is a pain in the butt. I mean, there's no doubt about that. And then you're trying to especially on our scale, I can imagine that it might be a little easier, still a pain in the butt, but easier on a larger commercial scale. But, you're trying to get it down to 170. You might overshoot that. Then you're all worried about whether that lower temp's going to be yada, yada. It just never, like I said, we could never flesh out that it actually has a noticeable impact. In theory, it makes sense. If we know that, that humulene evaporates at 210 degrees Fahrenheit, then it makes sense theoretically that if we get that wort to below 210, those terpenes aren't gonna go away. They're gonna be there. But something about the way that we brew and the way these hops work, it doesn't seem to be. If there's an impact, it's not big enough. That delta isn't big enough for us to be able to perceive it consistently, at the very least. Obviously, dry hopping. We've been able to show that different dry hopping, regimens do seem to have an impact. I know there's a lot of talk lately about the temperature of the beer when you dry hop. My understanding, I believe it was Mike Tonsmeyer I was talking to about this on a trip to New Zealand a few years ago about dry hopping temperature, because he and Scott at Sapwood Cellars, I believe, prefer cold dry hopping, or they might even do a warm dry hop and then chill the beer and do a cold dry hop as well. But it does seem to extract different characteristics from hops, apparently, and there's some evidence to support that, I guess.
Yeah, and the times I've tried it, I didn't love it, honestly. And so I think that more experimentation is needed for my system. But, the rumor was you get a grassy character, I think, with a colder dry hop. And I'm talking like, refrigeration temps. And I just didn't love it. And so I've just been dry hopping at room temp, like whatever the 68 or whatever I have at the end of fermentation. But then I will then crash cool on the dry hop. So I guess I'm getting a little bit of both. And I find that to work really well, and I'm getting the character I like. But so many people are talking about cold dry hopping, it begs for an experiment.
Yeah, I think we've done it. I think we've done it once, but it definitely begs for even more. I think that's an interesting variable. All right, now let's talk about dip hopping, because I do feel like this is the new kid on the block when it comes to, approaches to preserving as much of that hop character as possible. I've never done this. It is an interesting approach. I'm going to let you kind of explain it, Jordan, because you have done it. The history behind the one thing that I learned in researching this approach to of dip hopping is that it was developed in Japan at I think it's a craft brewery that's actually owned by a commercial brewery. It sounds like Kirin owns Spring Valley Brewery. And in 2012, they were messing around with these different, ideas that they had, and they came up with this method that we're now calling dip hopping. But if I'm not mistaken, they're pretty secretive about the approach that they take to doing it.
Well, looking on the internet and magazines and stuff, it seems the jury is still out. And actually in the comments, I think I took a little bit of heat for like, this isn't dip hopping. And it's like, well, what is dip hopping, right?
What is dip? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And so you're seeing a lot of different, I think that we're kind of building the ship as we sail it here. And a lot of brewers are experimenting with different methods. And I think that's what's fun about this idea of dip hopping is there isn't necessarily one true way yet. Maybe we'll develop a best practice going forward, but generally speaking, it's this idea that hops are steeped in warm water or wort, perhaps even in the fermentation vessel that is yet to receive the rest of the cold, sweet wort, for as little as 5 minutes up to an hour or longer, before the rest of the chilled wort is transferred into it. So the key there is basically you're making a hop tea that is sitting, and some people are even saying in a closed system. So they want to close that off so nothing's blowing off the top. And then while that sits there and brews that tea, you finish the rest of your brew day or knocking out your wort, etc. And then that is then combined with the standard chilled wort. And so it's fermented with the hop tea slurry in solution. And this whole idea here is this like lower temperature, because we said warm, right? It's not necessarily boiling, but even then, I don't know that there's necessarily a hard and fast rule. But
Right.
it's just this hop tea hanging out there. It can actually emphasize fruity notes and suppress less desirable characteristics such as the green myrcene note.
And that's the part that doesn't make any sense to me, because what's the difference between steeping, and this is why I kind of just shied. You read about in the position that we're in, Jordan, as part of Brewlosophy, we're getting inundated daily, basically, with, oh, you got to try this, or there's this new technique here. Homebrewers are used to this. If you hit any forum, you're constantly seeing of the next new big thing that's going to change the world of IPA. 99% of the time, it doesn't. And so
Right.
when I first heard of dip hopping, that was how I took it. I was like, okay, this is obviously a shtick. Who cares? There's nothing about letting, you take a half a pound of Citra hops and you let them steep in warm wort. Let's just call it 170 degrees Fahrenheit, around 77 C, for half an hour before, or 5 minutes even, before racking the rest of the wort on there. What's magical about that? Like, it doesn't make sense to me that it would have an impact, but maybe it does, right? And the fact that in doing that, you're going to reduce the myrcene notes, which is that green hop character, which I happen to be okay with. I don't mind it, but a lot of people want to get that out of the way so that the more fruity characteristics come out. Myrcene is one of the cooler, the terpenes that evaporates at one of the cooler temperatures. So how is that reducing the myrcene notes? Are you doing maybe that warm water or wort needs to be down around, I don't know, 100 degrees Fahrenheit or 37 C, who knows? But again, the people who developed this have been pretty secretive about the approach that they take, that they swear is having an impact, or at least that's what I've read. So yeah, outside of anecdotal reports from people who have played around this method, little else is known, about how dip hopping actually works. I mean, there really have not been many comparative experiments, which was why we did what we did. But before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about what maybe to expect from it in a style like American Pale Ale. We talked about it earlier, but when I think of American Pale Ale, I think of a relatively balanced, malt hop beer. It's going to accentuate the hops, but usually from later kettle editions, maybe a Whirlpool edition, and typically you're skipping over that dry hop edition to emphasize that balance. Dip hopping seems like an ideal approach if indeed it does what it claims to do.
Right. Yeah. And I think that the pale ale movement is kind of increasingly adopting a dry hop as a standard at this point, which at first I was like, well, then what's the difference between a pale ale and IPA? But I think that in a pale ale, if you're dry hopping, you're probably not doing the, 3 ounces per gallon or something like that some are doing on the IPA side. So maybe a defter touch there. But yeah, dip hopping, seems like a really interesting way to get extra hop and maybe unique novel hop characters that would be, maybe lost in an aggressively dry hopped IPA. And so I think that's why we wanted to look at that style in this experiment. I think the Kirin craft brewers, I think it was even a lager that they were doing this in. So Clearly this style is not limited to the pale ale format. And I think that a more, balanced or less aggressive style like a lager or a pale ale is an interesting canvas to try this out, because really my origin story here is I was just curious, what does dip hopping taste like objectively? Not so much does it necessarily have a noticeable difference between a control beer, but like what character do we actually get out of it? And so I thought a pale ale would be an appropriate background to try that out.
Yeah, I was talking to a commercial brewer one time, kind of a snarky dude who I like to go back and forth with, and his comment to me, we were talking about the difference between pale ale, modern pale ale and modern IPA, and his comment to me was, "Oh, the difference is in the brewer's sentiment when they're designing the recipe." And I thought that was pretty clever. I disagree with that. I think that there are legitimate differences, typically in terms of strength and the way that the hop characteristics display themselves. But I think dip hopping is a method again, that if it does what it's purported to do by emphasizing the fruitier characteristics of hops while restraining that myrcene, green, vegetal-ish characteristic, I think it has a place in both styles and pretty much any style, really. I mean, can you imagine getting more Saaz character out of that hop in a Czech Pilsner without any of the vegetal stuff? I mean, that'd be kind of cool. I could see how that would work. The idea though is does it actually do this? And I'll be honest, this was one of the ones where I was completely skeptical in the beginning that it would do anything. So now I've never tried dip hopping, like I said, and while I'm open to any new method that's aimed at improving hop character in beer, this one just seemed weird to me. So I couldn't understand how steeping hops in warm water or wort prior to adding the chilled wort to it would have any impact whatsoever. Well, that's exactly what you aim to find out in a recent experiment, Jordan. We're going to get into those results when we're back from this break. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com, and be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD. That's BRUPOD at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. Now, I can't speak for everybody, but I know for a fact you and I both love hoppy beer, Jordan, as much as our listeners might wonder about that with me, because some of the comments I've made in the past, I absolutely love IPA. And as such, I think we both really appreciate the development of new methods to extract as much hop character as possible. The latest method on that list is dip hopping, which you recently put to the test.
Yeah, so I did a single 10-gallon batch of American Pale Ale. That was using a grist that I thought would kind of give a good balance of malt character, but I do like a drier beer, and so I didn't want this to be a malt bomb. So I did 82% of Pilsner malt, 12% of Vienna malt, and 6% of German Carahel. And so I think that gives us a little bit of a bready, malt backbone, but without going, too dark or too high in the caramel malts.
Yeah, I love that malt bill. That's money.
Yep. And kind of similar to the THC Hop Chronicles malt bill, with just a little bit of extra Carahel, really.
Exactly.
So then I mashed that at 152 Fahrenheit or 67 C for 60 minutes. Kind of a standard, just American beer temperature there, where we then removed the grains and collected the sweet wort before we went into a 60-minute boil. So in that 60-minute boil, that's where hops start to come into play. And so, again, this was a single 10-gallon batch. So just for the listeners, I'm going to be quoting here on a 5-gallon scale, which you could see in the article recipe. That's 7 grams of Simcoe at 60 minute, which, by the way, is a great bittering addition for the low cohumulone content, allegedly. And then 7 grams of Centennial at 25, and then 14 grams each of Centennial and Citra at flame out. And I will say those numbers are pretty low compared to what I would be doing for an IPA. I would have way more flame out hops.
Yeah, in fact, I would contend that even for a lot of people making a regular pale ale, an American pale ale, those may be somewhat low numbers. I mean, a lot of people are tossing a lot of hops in late in the kettle or even mid kettle for their American pale ale. But I think the intention here was to really test what dip hopping does. Does it produce a noticeable characteristics compared to a beer that's not dip hopped? So this is where the variable comes into play, right? You boiled this wort, you chilled it down, but prior to finishing the boil of the wort, you stole some of it and you put it into a fermentation keg with some hops, right?
Precisely, yeah. I did not want this to be too aggressively hopped in terms of the boil and the flame out additions, because what if we can't then taste the difference? So we really wanted to try to isolate what sort of flavor impact does this method have or not. And so after the boil, or towards the end of the boil, I grabbed some of the wort, and I think I did like approximately a half gallon, evenly split into 2 fermentation kegs. And I wanted to make sure that a variable wasn't, or the difference wasn't a function of some hot wort being in solution. I don't know why that would. So I went ahead and grabbed some hot wort into both fermentation kegs, even though only one of them then received an ounce of Citra, that's 28 grams, that I then sealed them up and let them hang out for like 5 minutes. And then at that point, I turned on the HeatX and ran cool wort into both kegs at the same time using like a T-split to ensure, and then used a scale to ensure even fills, so that we then had chilled wort in both fermentation kegs, one of which had that dip hop addition.
So we're going to break this down now. And if our listeners are anything at all like the people who read the article, you're wondering, well, so one beer has an ounce more Citra in it than the other one. Of course, you're going to taste a difference. That may very well be the case, but we got to start somewhere. And that's an argument we make all of the time. What Jordan's aim here was, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you said it earlier, Jordan, was I want to know what difference this has. And even if it's more easy to perceive than some of the other variables we test, is it going to have this the impact of increasing this fruity characteristic in the beer? Again, this is a jumping off point. This is our first foray into the whole dip hopping thing. So I think it's a nice design here. And one of the things that I appreciate about this as well is that your pale ale recipe was kind of a legit pale ale in that it was lower ABV. It wasn't quite session, but you were right around 1047 OG, right?
Yep. And so then I pitched a pouch of Imperial Yeast A07 flagship into each batch. Chico is my preferred West Coast kind of strain. And I fermented that at a kind of cooler 64F or 18C for 3 days. I really like to kind of start cool on this strain before raising that to about 70 to ensure complete attenuation. So after another 3 days, I checked out some hydrometer measurements and showed the beers were at the same FG of 1013, which is, I think, a nice balance, that higher-ish FG for such a low OG to create some body. You don't want this to be too thin, starting kind of low for the pale ale range at 1047.
Yeah, there's a point on that I want to mention as well. I was wondering if maybe this idea of hop creep would come into play here. We often see when you add these big dry hop charges to beer that it will actually encourage a little bit more attenuation, right? And that's a whole other topic in and of itself. But I was really curious when you were designing this experiment whether or not that dip hopped beer would finish a little bit lower because of the additional Citra hops, and that just didn't pan out. I think that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I'm kind of surprised there too, but I guess, it is effectively a day zero, dry hop addition.
Yeah.
So it's there the whole time, so it can't necessarily kick off a new fermentation, or I wouldn't think it would, given that it was there from the very beginning of the yeast pitch. Additionally, maybe there's some denaturing of those enzymes from the hot wort steeping phase. So nonetheless, this one piece of evidence suggests that it didn't seem to create any additional attenuation, which did surprise me as well.
Yeah, the denaturing of enzymes was the first thing I thought as well, because you are doing a warm steep. And so that may very well kind of eliminate the risk of the whole hop creep thing. So interesting either way.
Right. And, I think one of the criticisms of this experiment was, well, why didn't you dry hop the other one with an ounce of Citra or something, so that it's not just testing the difference between 1 extra ounce of Citra. And I really wanted to be able to see, well, what does dip hopped beer taste like versus one that's not? Because, to me, it just felt like, and we debated this, internally, but like comparing that to dry hop, it was like, well, I was kind of curious, like I wanted a blanker canvas, if you will, to really compare that against.
Yeah, it's funny. That is a valid argument, right? I don't think anybody on Brewlosophy or anybody who's listening to us or anybody who reads the stuff that we put out would disagree that, well, yeah, you've got an extra ounce of hops in this beer. And we're gonna get into this whole idea in a bit after we share the results. But I think our intention with this, or at least what we understood of what you were proposing, Jordan, was that we wanted to establish that it has an impact anyways. We've done experiments in the past where, we're employing these hopping techniques that are, everybody believes that they have this impact. And we compare it to a beer where it's not done, and lo and behold, it didn't have a perceptible impact. So we want to do, at the very least, establish whether or not it does, contribute these hoppier characteristics to beer. So I feel like this was a good start, but it's just a start, and there's so much more to come from it. So let's carry on with the brew.
Yeah, and I honestly didn't know if I would even be able to detect a difference. It's like, really, does this really make a difference? So in terms of objective observations, they looked the same, identical color, clarity, and foam. And they look fairly pretty. And with this kind of grist, it's a really yellow beer, really pale beer. And really what I want for a pale ale. But what really matters is, can I taste, smell, or get a mouthfeel difference. And I did pretty good. I got 4 out of 5 right in a personal triangle test where it's semi-blind. I know the variable, but I don't know which cup holds which beer. And when comparing them kind of side by side in like proper glassware and knowing which is which, the Dip Hop beer had this brighter citra character, which I guess makes sense. It had a whole extra ounce that was added during fermentation via the Dip Hop method. And the other batch, honestly, was kind of flabby and boring, and I would not recommend this recipe without the dip hop. I would say that either do the dip hop or up the flame out, or maybe a little dry hop addition. So the dip hop beer, to me personally, knowing the variable, did seem to really elevate it, and honestly had this like brighter fruit character without the grassiness. And maybe it was just confirmation bias, like I was told that's what it does, and so that's what I think I was getting. But it was cool, and it did have this like unique, novel character. Would I do that to every single batch ever after there? I haven't done it since, but it was cool, and I probably should revisit it. And so, 4 to 5, I got them right.
Yeah. So, okay. Bias, this as a researcher, bias is always around. You cannot escape it. We can do everything possible to suspend our bias, but it's still having an influence. So yeah, maybe that's why you perceived what you did. And that's why we do blind data collection as well. But I do wonder, there have been so many times I've brewed easily over 100 experiments myself. There have been times where I'm comparing them, and that bias is obviously playing a role or whatever, and I know what beer's in which glass. But my assessment of one of the beers is necessarily relative to the way I perceived the other beer, which if I like one more, and that control beer is how I might have made it normally, now I'm looking and going, geez, I can't believe I made so many of those beers using that. I mean, a perfect example for me is water chemistry. I used to be the guy who's like, no, water doesn't matter. I listened to, I read the books. I've listened to the podcast. It's the last thing you should focus on. I totally disagree with that nowadays, right? Water chemistry absolutely has such a huge impact on the perceptible quality of beer that I can't believe I used to make these beers without adjusting mineral levels and such. I do wonder if your assessment of the control batch in this one was just because you liked the dip hopped batch so much more that you're like, wow, that next to it, this is really boring and flabby. There's really no way to know for sure, but I think it's interesting that you only got 4 out of 5 right, which seems to indicate that the difference wasn't so strong or so big, I should say, as to for the triangle test to be easy, as it were. Or would you say that it was, and that you just maybe had palate fatigue or something?
Who knows? I think that it definitely wasn't like as stark of the difference as like Pepsi versus milk or something like that. But
we've got to do that now.
right. But they were different, but also kind of similar, right? And so it definitely seems to make some sort of difference, but it's not night and day. But it's turning that knob to 11 to the point where 4 to 5 times I got it right.
Yeah. Pretty interesting stuff. So, of course, because you're biased and because you knew the variable, we served these beers to 29 blind participants. These are folks who had no idea what the variable was. And the only thing we tell them, and sometimes we don't even tell them this, is the style of beer they're tasting. And that's usually because they can kind of pick it out based on the way it smells. They're curious, and it doesn't really matter. Out of those 29 tasters, 15 would have had to identify the unique sample in the triangle test in order for us to say with some level of confidence that these beers were perceptibly different. And in the end, Jordan, how many people actually chose the odd beer out?
18 or 62% of tasters got it right, which is a significant finding in terms of the p-value, suggesting that tasters in this experiment could reliably tell a beer that was dip hopped apart from one that was not.
So when thinking about the triangle test, I mean, we've had so many people comment on experiment articles, well, that's more than half. How did you not, get to significance, yada, yada. It does matter. There are 3 beers, not 2. And so you have to split it into thirds. And the way the p-value works, question its accuracy all you want. That's fine. But the way it works is that you have to have just enough people over what you would expect by random guessing to choose the unique sample. And that will get you to a point where you can say, okay, so there's something a little different here. There seems to be more people than we would expect to choose this by random chance selecting it, that we can say with some level of confidence that there's a difference here. You had 18 out of 29 people, which is more than half, but it's actually, right around that 2/3 mark as opposed to 1/3, which you would expect. That's pretty strong evidence that the dip hopped batch made had an impact, that it was perceptibly different. Again, this was not a 100% thing. So there were still, what is that? 11 people who could not tell these beers apart, or who were unable to distinguish the odd beer out in the triangle test, which goes to show this wasn't a bullseye. It didn't have that huge of an impact, which is interesting when you consider the fact that one of the beers had an ounce more Citra in it than the other one did. I think, at least, that's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, and I will say that I take this to my homebrew club and I get a big bulk of my tasters there. And these people are nerds, dude. They're BJCP, Grandmaster, whatever. And so they have a good time with it. But I really appreciate their feedback. And I think it's a really good source for a really well-rounded taster judge to get sink their teeth into this. But I also serve it to lay people, my friends that they would love to have a beer from me, but they don't know Citra from Mosaic from Attenuation,
Yeah.
And so I do recall that lay people were not as good at getting this right. And so I think that is one thing that you'll even see in professional panels, is their trained tasters might perform differently than their lay tasters. And so, and that's why we want a kind of a representative sample in our results, or ideally we would get a representative sample, because some groups might be better, like super tasters, and others are not. And so what's your target market? Are you selling to the general public? Are you selling to beer nerds? And so I think that there is a bit of acumen that could be associated with our ability to tell these things apart.
Maybe. I question
some
that.
Things at least.
Yeah, just based on we've done we did a full on analysis of our first, I think it was like 50 or 60 experiments, where we broke down. We used to ask people what their drinking experience is, whether you're a BJCP judge, just a Coors Light drinker or whatever, and lo and behold, everybody was exactly the same. In fact, on our analysis, the people who've never brewed a batch before and who aren't even really big craft beer nerds did a slightly better at picking the odd beer out than the non-nerds, basically. So I question whether that is actually a thing. It makes sense to think that, but maybe in this instance, people who are familiar with hop character would be more able to pick it out. But regardless, the reality is it was a significant result, so it sort of doesn't matter. And I would imagine that if you were to do this next to a beer, that maybe was hopped differently with that 1 ounce of Citra, that delta would be even smaller. But I think that is that would be kind of the next line of experimentation with dip hopping, right? Is, okay, now that we've established that it does seem to have a perceptible impact, what do we want to compare it to where the hopping rates are identical, right? I would love to see, for example, a whirlpool versus a dip hopped beer, or dip hop versus dry hop.
Right.
Are we extracting different terpenes? Is that myrcene level actually lower? I mean, it'd be really interesting to get some measurements on this process to see if it is actually doing this thing that it's claimed to do. Now, one thing we didn't hit on yet, we kind of skipped over, but I think it'd be interesting to get into, is the preference data.
Right.
Whenever we get a significant result, we collect this data no matter what. But when somebody gets picks the odd beer out on the survey, they are redirected to a comparison chart or a comparison survey where we ask them just to compare the two beers that are different and then pick the one that they like the most. That's it. And there are 4 options. One is they can admit that they don't really actually perceive much of a difference. The other one says that they perceive a difference, but they don't really have a preference. They like both or don't like both. The other one is that you prefer, the control batch. The other one is that you prefer the experimental batch. In this case, there was a pretty big pile up on one of those.
Yeah, and I think this has got to be one of the most lopsided ones we've seen, right? So often,
if not the most, yeah.
Really? Yeah, because so frequently, these things will come out insignificant, and then preferences split. And it doesn't matter the variable. Things like under pitching or hot fermentation, things that should make a theoretically gross beer, the preferences always split. So this was really telling, and that of the 18 that got it right, 14 preferred the dip hop batch. Only 2 preferred the beer that wasn't dip hopped, and we had one that said no preference and one that said I actually didn't taste the difference, but I got the answer right.
Yeah. So here's the deal with that. We get questions all the time. I think it's kind of a knee-jerk thought process for human beings to want to know what's the best, right? The truth of the matter is what's best is what you think is the best. That it is purely and wholly subjective. Now, like you said, if you're telling people to pick your favorite beer and you serve them milk and have them compare it to an IPA, obviously you could say, well, the IPA is the better beer if most people picked it because it's the only beer. In this case, all we can say with this preference data is that it seems like most of the tasters in this particular experiment like hoppier beer or like the hoppier version of
Exactly.
That's how I read this preference data. I say it a million times. I hate this question, but people have begged for it, so we keep it on the survey. It is kind of interesting. The only other experiment that I can recall that was this lopsided or close to this lopsided was one that I did comparing old Simcoe hops to, and I think they were like 10 years old and oxidized, to a fresh batch of Simcoe hops in a pale ale. And it was kind of similar to this. The vast majority of people preferred the fresh Simcoe hops, but there was like 1 or 2 people who picked the other one, which blew my mind because it was nasty.
Yeah.
But you're going to get that. And that doesn't minimize their preference. Preference is just preference. And I wanted to talk about that because I love how lopsided it is. Because again, it kind of speaks to this idea that in this day and age, people just kind of seem to like hoppy beer.
Right, but I will say that it was a interesting character. It wasn't like, yep, that one had 1 ounce of dry hops. It really was different, and it was really nice. Yes, maybe people prefer a hoppier beer, but also maybe the dip hopping does have something unique about it, and people tended to enjoy it over, like I said, a kind of a flabby, boring, almost like a blonde ale.
Yeah. Would you say that the difference, I mean, again, bias is going to play a role here. We can't deny that. But would you say that you perceived less of that green hop note and more of just the kind of pure fruity characteristics of Citra?
It was different for sure. And it wasn't like the non-dipped hop beer was green, and this one wasn't. It was more like it just had this like really fruit character without any of the green. But again, we didn't taste green in the non-dipped hopped either because, it wasn't like that. If you don't do this method, you're going to have like a green bomb.
Yeah. Now that would be weird if that's what we figured out, that it actually, if you do this, you actually reduce the chances of there being that green hop bomb. I'm a weirdo. I love when I open up a beer and I get that, like I'm walking through a hop field aroma.
Me too.
I love it. It reminds me of being in Yakima for hop harvest, and so the reduction of the myrcene isn't something that I'm necessarily after. And perhaps that's a function of my age in the brewing world, is that as we were coming up with all of those methods we discussed in the last segment, that was really what we were after, was we just wanted to smell like hops. Now we've got all these different, hop varieties that impart different characteristics, but all of them have that hoppy smell kind of underlying the other stuff. And I tend to enjoy it. So maybe this is a method that will work for you. Maybe it's something that doesn't work out very well at all. I think implication wise, it's obvious that the subsequent experiments that we need to start doing and looking into are going to compare dip hopping to other methods where the same amount of hops are used to see if we can parse out that it does do something qualitatively different than, say, whirlpool or dry hopping. And it's an easy enough one. I mean, it's a post-boil variable, which we tend to shy away from, but I think it's a poignant enough variable that we really do need to readdress it. my hunch would be that, and again, this is just my hunch, but that if you compared a dip hopped batch done using methods that I think people are starting to hone a little bit more, which is cooler, not cold, but slightly cooler than boiling temperature, steeping liquid, and also a longer rest, right? I think people are now kind of settling on 20 to 30 minutes or so for the dip hop, but that if you compare that to a beer that's dry hopped with the same amount of the same variety of hops, my guess is people aren't going to be able to tell them apart, but I could be wrong on that.
Yeah, I mean, who knows? So we got to do the experiment.
That's the best response, right? Well, let's do it. Let's just test it out. So, you said you haven't dip hopped since this experiment, but it is something that you would consider doing in the future again?
Actually, kinda. The only thing I've done since then that's similar is dip hopping with the new incognito. The incognito is supposed to be added during the hot side because it needs to dissolve in the wort, and it's an oil, hop product, a flowable, and it's recommended for the whirlpool. And I guess you could probably add it in the last 5 minutes or something too. But you can't just add this oil to cold liquid. It won't dissolve or go into solution. And so one method that I've heard people playing around with is knocking off some of your beer hot into your fermenter, and then you add that incognito, and that's able to dissolve it, and then you knock the rest off cold, and then you ferment that out. And dear God, this beer is incredible. Now I'm dry hopping and whirlpooling all throughout as well, and I'm also using Spectrum, and so I'm not able to necessarily disentangle what that specifically added. I also added incognito in the flame out as well, but man, finding more places to add more hops is a good thing in my book.
You mentioned a few things, incognito, Spectrum. Just for those who are listening who may not be aware of what that stuff is, they're Haas, what we call hop products. They're all pure hop products, just without any of the leafy material. If you want to experiment with some really amazing hop products, go check out what Haas has to offer at johnihaas.com. This stuff is incredible. I think it's going to change the brewing world for the better in the long run. So what we can say with confidence based on this experiment is that dip hopping does seem to have a qualitative impact on the perceptible characteristics of beer, and that's pretty rad. We can't say much else because of the design of this specific, first iteration of a dip hopping experiment. But I think because we've established that it does actually seem to have an impact, we can move forward now and start comparing it to other methods. And I think that's pretty rad. It's an easy enough approach that, I think in the future, I might be willing to give it a shot on even a one-off, single batch, IPA just to see how it works. And I think it's pretty cool that we have yet another tool in our tool belt to use for making these types of beers. So, we did get some reader comments on this that I think we should address. The first one comes from Free Healer, who says, "How is dip hopping novel? It's just another name for whirlpool hopping. Whether done in the fermenter or kettle, it's just whirlpool hopping. Am I missing something?" Free Healer, yes, I think you are missing something. Jordan, please explain.
Well, one, dip hopping can be done in water. And so I think that's a critical difference. Granted, in this experiment, we did wort, but I think that's fundamentally different, like a hop tea in water versus sugar, wort, etc. But secondly, they said, is it like whirlpooling? Well, this is the whirlpool. You don't then just open the valve and put all the hop trube into your fermented beer. So it's co-fermenting on the quote unquote whirlpooled hops. And so temperature, time, presence in the fermenter, I think that's the key difference.
Yeah, here's the thing, Free Healer. I totally get where you're coming from. I think these were the same questions I asked when you were designing the experiment, Jordan. So I get where you're coming from. It just feels the same. Just because it's done in a different vessel or at a slightly different temperature. I mean, really, what's different? That's what we're going to have to test out in the future. And I think that is going to give us or get us closer to that answer of whether dip hopping is this unique approach that has a unique impact on beer character. So next comment comes from Taylor Norland, who says, "Jordan, I love what you're bringing to the Brewlosophy team so far." Jordan, so do we. You know that. He says, "I'm hoping you could explain this technique a little further, maybe even on the podcast." Well, here you go, Taylor. Is this just basically a high concentrated hop stand in the fermentation vessel? Were the hops removed? If not, how did you prevent clogging your dip tubes? That's a good question. Could this be just done in a separate kitchen pot and filtered back through a hop spider?
Good questions. So that is an interesting point. It is kind of highly concentrated, right? Because it was like 1.5 ounce So I guess that'd be like kind of an aggressive dry hop rate, but not out of the realm of possibility. But in terms of flame out, that is definitely highly concentrated. So yeah. I think that's an accurate assessment. In terms of like clogs and stuff, it worked out well. I fermented these in the identical kegs that have a cut dip tube, and it's like one of those dip tubes that curves to like the side or whatever. So the cut dip tube is like along the rim as opposed to the center. And luckily, the fermentation, etc., the hops in the dip hop batch were actually below the cut dip tube, and they kind of like sunk below the yeast. And I was kind of worried about this as an issue. I will frequently use a floating dip tube, but this time I used the cut dip tubes and it worked just fine. In terms of straining, I don't think that's dip hopping anymore. I think that the hop material is supposed to be present during fermentation, with the whole slurry, not just the liquid. So I think that straining would certainly be one way to get some sort of interesting hop character ostensibly. But if we want to follow the method as it's currently being built, you need that pellet or cone material in the fermenter. So straining would kind of violate that theory.
Yeah, that's my understanding as well. The interesting thing, though, what could be interesting is when we really get into the weeds on this approach, is to do a comparison eventually of where we strain the hops from that liquor, right? That tea, and keep them in and see if that has an impact later on down the line. I could see it not really having much of an impact because you've already extracted the stuff that you're looking to extract anyways. But if it does, I mean, again, that's another interesting factor. That's another finding that people can use to adjust that hop character in their beer. Very interesting questions, Taylor. Final question comes from Jonah, who says, this is a really cool idea. It would be interesting to see how it would compare to a batch that simply had 28 grams of Citra added at yeast pitch, or maybe even as a standard dry hop. Jonah, that is exactly what we were talking about, and I couldn't agree more. Jordan, I have a feeling that this is probably going to be kind of the next line of research on dip hopping that we do.
Yeah, because I think it begs the question, well, does this taste different than just quote unquote standard dry hopping, or at the very least fermentation dry hopping?
Yeah. And the two that really stick out in my mind that I want to see the comparison to are, well, maybe the three really, would be a flame out edition, a hop stand edition at 170 Fahrenheit, which I think is a pretty common hop stand rest temperature, and then a dry hop. And comparing dip hopping to all of those, I can't wrap my brain around thinking that it would make any difference whatsoever. But if it does, and we're able to kind of show that, flesh that out, holy cow, I think that could be a really neat, evidence to back up the use of this novel approach, but also like, wow, what is actually happening here, right? I mean, that's where my mind would go.
Right, and if you're like me, I'll just do them all because I want it all.
Everything I possibly can to get as much hop character into this beer. Well, Jordan, that is all the time we've got on dip hopping. I feel like we've covered it as deeply as we possibly can, at least for now. Rest assured, this will not be our last foray into this method. Do you have any final comments before we wrap this one up? Yeah,
let's keep experimenting with dip hopping, different temperatures, different amounts, different styles. I can't wait to try this in a lager. I think there's just so much more to explore.
Yeah, and keep coming up with these awesome new methods because it gives us so much more grist for the proverbial mill. So, well, don't forget to subscribe to the Brew Lab podcast, where Brewlosophy's Kay Jobe and occasionally you, Jordan Folks, take you into the lab with real brewing scientists to discuss the fascinating research they've done on our favorite beverage. And as always, you can read more about the experiment we discussed by clicking the link to the article on brewlosophy.com in the description of this episode. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it soothes my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman.